Hello, and welcome to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole. I'm so happy to be with you today. This is Asian American Pacific Islander Month, and this has been such an interesting time for America to pay closer attention to the AAPI community. I think many of us have realized that we haven't paid enough attention to our brothers and sisters who are part of that community. My husband is Jamaican and Chinese. His grandfather was Chinese. My daughter has been doing research on her Chinese heritage, even more now that folks are paying attention to the Asian American community more. And I thought it would be really interesting to bring on a dear friend of mine who has the same parentage as my husband, who is quarter Jamaican Chinese, to talk about what's going on in our world today and her unique perspective of being both of Asian descent and African American descent and Jamaican descent, and what all of that means right now in our world. So right now, I just have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Paula Madison. Hi, Paula.
Thank you, Harriet. Hi to you. I'm happy to be with you and to see you. How you doing?
I'm doing great, and it's just wonderful to be with you too. I want to give folks context. Paula is like the media powerhouse. I have to brag about you. She spent many, many years in television. I mean, at the end, you were at the tippy top at NBC Universal trying to get everything straight after that crazy Don Imus debacle, right?
Right. Yeah.
But after spending so many years in media, you stepped away and started a whole new part of your journey, which meant looking for your grandfather's roots. And you wrote a book and made a documentary, Finding Samuel Lowe. Can you tell us about that decision to make this pivot from this amazing career at a time when you were at the height of your career?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. So first of all, I should just put into context that I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised in Harlem, and I'm the child of Jamaican immigrants. So my father was African Jamaican, my mother's Chinese Jamaican, and as you stated, your husband has the same kind of lineage in that he also has had a Chinese grandfather, and his family hails from Jamaica, which is not that uncommon in Jamaica, and it's not uncommon in Cuba, Trinidad and Tobago, Honduras, Belize. There are a number of places throughout the Caribbean, Panama, where a reasonably significant percentage of the population is mixed race Chinese. The decision that I made to step away from NBC Universal, and my career included a stint of 11 years in New York at NBC 4, the television station. The last 6 years that I was there, I was the news director. I ran the news department at the station. And then I moved out to Los Angeles, where I was president and general manager of the NBC station here in LA. I made the decision to do that when I was 6 years old, meaning that when I was 6 years old, I, who, along with my two older brothers, were raised in Harlem by our mother, who Chinese father, African Jamaican mother. My mother immigrated to Harlem in 1945. And my father left Jamaica in pursuit of her to marry her. They did get married, and we were born in Harlem. Our parents split. Our mother looked completely Chinese, and we look completely Black. Okay, so that meant we're growing up in a Black neighborhood, in a Black community, where almost everybody was hailed from North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina. They came up the East Coast and into New York, and our neighborhood was mostly populated by Black folks from those states. And it was like a chain migration because every kid who we knew, their aunts, their uncles, their grandparents, cousins, all lived within a mile or so of our neighborhood. We were like on our own little island. It was my mother and the three of us. There weren't Chinese people in our neighborhood, which is 164th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. Sort of today, it's called Washington Heights. Back then, it was the end of Harlem, and only the gentleman who owned the Chinese laundry and the folks who worked in the Chinese restaurant a block away were the only Chinese people in our community. We did see Chinese people because occasionally our mother would take us down to Chinatown, which was, back then you'd get on the AA train and go, I don't know, maybe 35 minutes south and get off at like Spring Street and you walk a few blocks and you're in Chinatown. But I'm saying all that to say that we became very, very aware of race at early ages because we attended a Catholic school a block away from our home. All the teachers, all the faculty, for the most part, were Irish Catholic nuns, or they were Irish lay people. Our school, the population was almost all Irish kids, some Puerto Ricans, a few Cubans, a handful of Blacks. And what we knew was that whenever we were outside playing, we just blended in with everyone else. But when our mother came outside to tell us to come in for dinner or whatever, everything changed because what is that Chinese lady doing over there? And why is she talking to those kids? It was just an interesting conversation, as I said, which led me to an early awareness of race. My mother was very isolated. She stayed in our apartment. She hardly interacted with the people in our neighborhood. And she always impressed me as very sad, very melancholy. I can't remember many times when my mother threw her head back and laughed with real gusto. And so at a young age, I concluded that because my mother talked about the importance of family so much, the three of you, you only have each other. You have to stay, with each other. You have to take care of each other. You have to invest in and pool your money together and buy property. So my mother was very family focused. We had no real family around. She was always sad. As a little girl, I concluded, well, the reason why she's sad must be because she doesn't have any family. I bet if I find her family, she'll be happy. Mm-hmm. So when I was a little girl, I pledged that I would someday go to find my mother's father. When I was a teenager in college, and then I went off, I graduated, I got my first job. I realized then that the end of your work life is 65 years old. Like, oh, 65, that's retirement age. And I thought, oh my God, that's really old, because I had a plan still of going to find my mother's Chinese family. Well, I can't wait until then because I'll be really old. So in my 21-year-old head, I took the age of 65 and I subtracted the number 7, which then was my lucky number. 7 from 65 is 58. When I was 21 years old, I decided I would retire when I was 58 years old and go to find my mother's family in China.
Wow.
You were kind of along with me on that journey, Harriet.
Oh, yes.
How old was I when I retired? 58.
Yes, you were.
Right. So none of this was kind of serendipitous. I had exactly. I had a plan.
Paula. Wow. And even through your youth and all the different experiences that you have had in your life, you never veered from that plan.
I didn't. And I should clarify. My mother told us that she had never seen her father after she was 3 years old. Right? She said her mother and her father they broke up. She didn't explain in detail, but she said that the Jamaicans harassed her mother for being with a Chinaman, right? And in my little girl head, I didn't understand what that meant. I later, I figured out what happened. But what I will say is that I knew at the age of 58, it was very unlikely my grandfather would be alive. But my mother told us this story. She said, my father returned to China and died. So I grew up believing that my grandfather was dead. So my intention was to find his family, my family in China. Well, later on, after doing all the research, I learned that my grandfather did in fact return to China, but he did not die upon his arrival. He lived for many years after. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know that, and I'm sure my mother didn't know that.
And just to give some context to, as you mentioned, all the different countries in the Caribbean where there were Chinese immigrants, early on, Chinese people were among the first immigrants from Asia. And I wonder, can you give some context to what life was like for them coming into the Caribbean, and then later they came into the United States?
Sure, absolutely. I want to make a distinction in that George and I, your husband George and I, and most Chinese Jamaicans hail from a cultural group known as Hakka, Hakka. And the Hakka people are genetically Chinese, right? They are the Han people of China. More than 90% of China's population is Han. So that's what George and I are also. Mm-hmm. But this cultural minority group called Hakka is just that. It's a cultural minority group in that they come from a certain region of southeastern China. And we're known to be very clannish. We stick together a lot. And so the Hakka people, Hakka translates to the word guest, Guest. I interpret that, however, in a different way, meaning that I interpret Hakka as invaders, interlopers. They were not the local people. So in the region where we come from in China, which is Guangdong province, the local people are known as Bunti. It's spelled Punti, Bunti. So those are the Cantonese, the Toisanese, the Zhongshanese. These are the people who come from the cities in the Canton region of China, right? So we were all heard of Canton, but today Canton is called Guangzhou. It's called Guangzhou. Just like we used to say Peking, and now it's Beijing, right? So Canton is no longer called Canton, it's Guangzhou. So in the city around Guangzhou, you had these other people who I was mentioning earlier, and you had the Hakka people. The Hakka people became enemies of all these other people who were local to the region, right? The Hakka people originally come from north central China and were driven south through wars and migration, starting with the Khans, Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan. Mm-hmm. So the wars went on and they were driven south, 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 and east until they settled, right, in the southeasternmost part of China, the Pearl River Delta. So around Hong Kong and up north by Meizhou is where most of the Hakka people in China are concentrated. We were enemies with these other people who I call the Bunti. If you go to Cuba today, 20% of Cuba's population is mixed race Chinese, right? That means 1/5 of Cuba, which is a large island, is mixed race Chinese. Now, those folks are from Toisan, Zhongshan, the Canton area, Guangzhou. They are not Hakka, right? They're not the people who George and I hail from. We are in Jamaica. Lots of us are in Panama, some in Trinidad, but to explain how and why we would be localized onto certain islands and in certain countries is to take a look at how the migration happened. You couldn't put these enemies on the same ship, right? They could not board the same ship because they'd kill each other, right? And at that point in the 1830s, the 1840s, they were heading to the west in order to work the sugar plantations After the Africans who had been enslaved were emancipated, whatever that means, the cheap labor, to work the plantations came from China overwhelmingly, and some came from India, right? That is why, as you roam the Caribbean and you look at the people from the Caribbean, from the islands, you see a look. There's a look to them. And if you know where they hail from, China and India, that begins to explain the look, right? These are people who are mixed with Chinese, Indian, African, and even European, right? Meaning that in those days, many of the slave overseers who were particularly brutal and who kept the enslaved Africans working torturously, many of those men were from Scotland. Right. Which is why when African Americans and Caribbeans research their ancestry, it's like, oh, from the British Isles. Oh, from Scotland. Oh, how is that? Well, that's because those were the rapists, right? Those are the rapists of the African female ancestors, right? And that's where that comes from. Now, so many of
let me just remind folks, Paula, because we're in it, but let me remind, if people have joined us, you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. Every time I talk to Paula, it could be like hours and hours and hours. So I know you all are riveted. We are talking to my friend Paula Madison, who is just giving us an education. And I bet you there are folks listening who don't know this. We're talking about heritage, about family, about culture, and the premise of this is that Paula is American, Jamaican, Chinese. And she's giving us an understanding of how those of us who are part of this cultural mix came to be. And Paula, when you talk about Scotland, isn't it also true that the first Europeans who were sent over here to the States, to America, were Scottish and Irish who were imprisoned? Wasn't that?
Well, sure. I mean, what we have to do is take a look at who were the Pilgrims, right? Oh my God, the Pilgrims, they got here on the boat, the Mayflower. Oh my God. Well, they were escaping religious persecution. They were white people from England who wanted to practice the religion that they believed in. But let's remember that up until a certain time throughout Europe, many of the nations of the powers of Europe, in fact, were followers of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. So let's collectively refer to those people as papists. I will say here that I was born and raised a Roman Catholic. I went to 12 years of Catholic school. But the terminology was papists. They followed the papal theory. They followed the Pope. There came a point when King Henry wanted to marry his wife's cousin. Because he wanted to marry his wife's cousin, and the Pope would not give him a divorce.
His wife's cousin.
His wife's cousin. But remember, there's a reason why these people have very strange faces and snaggly teeth. There was a lot of intermarriage that went on within their tribes, right? So when you look at the Habsburgs and you look at that whole lineage of who the Windsors, these are people who intermarried, right? So the same people who ran Spain, the same people who ran England, the same people who ran Italy, they all intermarried. So they're all kind of cousins, right? And some closer than others. And the families had the male children, Prince somebody, marry the female children, Princess somebody, in order to maintain a stranglehold over land. They combined their lands, right? So it had nothing to do with love. When King Henry wanted to marry his wife's cousin, the Pope would not give him a divorce or an annulment, right? An annulment. So Henry was outraged, and he said, "Screw you, Pope. I'm going to start my own church." He banned the Catholic Church from the British Empire and started what's called the Church of England.
Right.
The Church of England we know today to be one, Anglican, right?
Yep.
Right? Episcopalian. So the roots of the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church is the Church of England. The roots of that is the Roman Catholic Church. So what we have here then is you have a whole argument over religion. These people were not going to comply. And so they said, all right, we're leaving. And they were kicked out of England, and they were put on a boat, the Mayflower, which sailed to the United States, and they got off. And what happened with them, right? They did have some Africans who were enslaved. They came, and what they did was begin to die off because they didn't have the skills, the knowledge to survive here in the United States, in America. And the indigenous people helped them, and they immediately infected the indigenous people. They subjugated the indigenous people. It's the tradition of, the sort of propagation of the empire. So, yep. All right. So now when we come back to the history of how all this happened and who got here first, the Chinese started coming in the 1840s and 1850s in order to replace the, when I say here, I mean throughout the islands, right? In order to replace the enslaved Africans who even upon no longer so-called being enslaved, refused to work for the same people who had just brutalized them. So they brought in Chinese. They housed the Chinese in the same slave quarters. They beat the Chinese very much the same way they beat the Africans. And what happened was, especially in Cuba, the enslavement there was so brutal that the Chinese got word back to China how they were being treated. China sent an investigative envoy to Cuba to see if they were really being treated this way, and they were. And what happened was China banned the Cubans from coming to China to recruit Chinese workers. Okay, so in any case, what you have in Cuba are the people from a particular region, and if this man and this man came and it worked out okay, let's pretend now we're in Honduras. It worked out okay. They would get word back to their cousins, their uncles, their brothers, their nephews, their sons. Hey, you guys should come too. So you had whole populations coming from the same 2 or 3 or 5 villages to a particular region in order to make money. They had contracts. It was to work usually anywhere from 3 to 5 years. At the conclusion of that time, you could go back to where you came from. But here's the reality of what happened. Many of these people, these men, overwhelmingly were living and working on plantations. And so they were subjected to the same thing we as Africans know, that whole plantation entrapment system where, well, if you want shoes, if you want food, you have to pay exorbitant rates, right? And we'll take a certain percentage out of the money that you earn so that by the time a year goes by, 2 years go by, you didn't earn anything, right? All you did was pay back to the people who were employing you. I put that word in quotes, right? So ultimately what you had was they didn't allow women nor families to join the men.
Right.
They could not come
about it, right?
Right. They could not come. It was only men. They wanted just the laborers. The handful of women who came were most often brought to be sex workers. You understand? Yeah. So these white men were bringing Chinese women over to be sex workers. Well, not sex workers for the Chinese men who were working sun up to sundown, right? It was sex workers for the white men, right? So ultimately what you had was, after a period of time, the immigration laws were somewhat eased and the men could in fact bring wives and families. But until then, they had wives and families in China for the most part, but they're stuck on the island or on this continent with no women. Well, one thing we know men are going to do is have their biological needs addressed. So they were having sex with local women. Who were the local women? Well, I happen to be right now in the state of California. As I said, I'm originally from New York, but in California, what we had in this state were Chinese men who had children from one length of the state to the other with Black women, right? With Mexican women, with indigenous women. So throughout California, you have at least a century. You have at least a century of mixed racing in California, of mixing race in California with Chinese people. So you have people here who go back 4 or 5 generations, whose great-grandfathers came from China and they're still in California.
Well, and Paula, you know, this is something that my daughter's studying right now in school, so it's fascinating. But there was, one of the things that she learned in the United States, as you say, in California, you know, some of them had come over with the gold rush. That was another wave. And then there was no more gold. And there was
worse than that. It's worse than that.
Yeah. And then the I want you to get to the 1882 law that was passed. Yeah. So talk about that. Please.
So it isn't that there was no more gold. It's that so remember back then, there was no such thing as passports. There weren't visas.
Right.
You just had to have money for a ticket, right? So you had Chinese men who heard about the gold mines in California, right, on the West Coast. And so they're rushing to get here because there was poverty over there, right, in China. So in fact, the name for this nation translated into Chinese is Gold Mountain. This nation is known as Gold Mountain among the Chinese. So they came here, and when they arrived, what they learned was, not for you. We're not letting you go into these mines and bring out our gold and our silver. So these Chinese men got here and they were stranded. They did not have money for passage back because the intent was, I'm going there, I'm going to be rich, right? When I make money, I will send for the rest of you, my family. I will go home with money. And so what they found, the ugly, brutal reality was that no mining for you. Now, here's what did happen. The men who were mining were white men. Those men went underground deep, and when they came up, they were hungry and they were dirty, right? From being down in the mines, working, when they came up, the Chinese men who were stranded needed to figure out how to make money. So they said, well, we'll cook for you and we'll do your laundry. Now, up until all that happened, there actually were people, men, who were putting their soiled clothes on ships to go back to Hong Kong, where they were laundered and brought back. That was even sometimes easier and made more sense, because who's going to do their laundry? There were no women. There's certainly no laundromats, no such thing like that. But the Chinese, being very resourceful, said, we'll cook for you. Now, all this stuff that here in the United States people eat, you know, egg foo young, chop suey, that's not Chinese food. That is Harriet, that is not Chinese food, right? That is Chinese men saying, let's see what the ingredients are around here, and we're going to cook it the way we know how to cook, but we'll try to tailor it to the taste of these white people. And that's how you got that kind of, I'll call it cuisine. Cuisine. Okay. But the reality is, I want to disavow any of your listeners from thinking that Chinese have a particular genetic skill regarding cooking and laundering. That is not anything that we are born with. what did happen is that the only way for them to make money was to cook the food of these miners and to do their laundry. Now, it progressed from the 1840s, there's that, and then what happens? You were talking about a law in the 1880s. It's the beginning of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, the first one being signed into law in 1882. Right. The Chinese Exclusion Acts, the singular unique property associated with the Chinese Exclusion Acts is that the Chinese are the only nationality ever in the history of the United States to be banned from citizenship.
That's right.
Right? They could not become citizens under any circumstances. So beginning in 1882, these laws were passed and renewed every 5 to 10 years. I think they originally started out being called the Page Act. Started in California, spread across the United States. And so what you had was the exclusion in the Chinese Exclusion Acts was that if you, a Chinese man, wanted a visa to come to the United States, the only way you could get a visa would be if you were going to own a Chinese restaurant or to own a Chinese laundry. The United States said to the Chinese, the only profession/skill business that you can bring into this country where we will let you come in legally with a visa is if you feed us and do our laundry.
Oh my God.
All right. Now, the way that the Chinese got around this was about every 18 months or so, if person A, Mr. A, owned a Chinese laundry, 18 months later, he would sell it to his brother, person B. 18 months later, person B would sell it to his cousin, person C. Now, what that meant was you had each one of them who was able to come into the United States with a visa. They didn't have to leave because they already were legal residents. Harriet, that's why in certain cities, you find a Chinese restaurant on every block.
Right.
And you used to find Chinese laundries every 10 blocks or so, right?
So true.
The Chinese laundries went away with the advent of what? The automatic washing machine.
That is so true.
When the washing machine...
Paula, let me remind folks who have just joined, you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole here on WBAI in New York City and everywhere online at WBAI.org. And we are connected across the country, which is why I love the .org, because we can, technology helps us to be together. Right. We are talking to Paula Madison, who just one of the most dynamic people that I know. And she is just dropping history, y'all, so that we can understand. See, one of the problems for so many people is that they don't know anything about our history. And so, even people who call themselves woke, who just aren't because they don't know. And what I do on this show is to bring people on who can educate us, who can help us to be uplifted and to be able to see what is the truth. And as we know, we had an intense 4 years of lack of truth telling, but honestly, that has been going on for so very long. Right. And what we're doing right now is learning. I want to say to you, that's what WBAI does, and we need your support. I'm not giving you a long speech about it because we want to get back to Paula. What I need you to do is to go in your wallet, pull out some dollars and share it with us so we can keep guests like Paula Madison on. You can call after the broadcast so you can keep listening to Paula. But our number is 212-209-2950. You can make a contribution of any size. You can become what we call a BAI buddy, which is where you give a monthly contribution. It could be as low as $25 a month. You can make a one-time contribution. The number 212-209-2950. You can also go online and give to the numeral 2 WBAI.org. We need you. We are listener-sponsored radio, no ads, just folks like me who host shows asking you, help us to keep bringing folks like Paula Madison on so we can just keep this conversation going. So please be generous. As soon as the show is over, go make a contribution. So Paula, I want to fast forward for a minute because we just got deep into the history, which is so important. But why this conversation has come top of mind for so many people is all of these outrages against Asian American people.
Mm.
And one of the things that happened, I want to tell you this. I interviewed a young Asian American woman on WBAI recently. It was right after the murders in Atlanta. And several Black men called in to challenge her and say that that wasn't racism.
Mm.
And it got very uncomfortable and kind of ugly. And in part, what I figured out, because I've had a lot of these conversations now, there are a number of Black people who I'm hearing don't want to acknowledge that other people have had this degree of racism.
Mm.
I think out of the pain of our history. But I want you to unpack,
Sure.
this, please.
Sure. So let me I'm gonna take 30 seconds to be in history, and then I'm coming back out of it.
Okay.
For everybody who grew up in certain areas of the South, Black folks who grew up in certain areas of the South, many of you, depending upon your age, will recall that there was a Chinese grocer somewhere in that town, somewhere in the community. And the Chinese grocer most often lived on the property because they couldn't live where the white folks lived, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times that Chinese grocer would sell his or her goods to the Black community on credit. When you get paid, you could pay me back. There's a ledger book, right? There's a ledger book. I'm saying that to say that we as African Americans have had throughout our history Chinese in and around our communities. Those same men who were not allowed to mine were later on put on the railroads and built the Intercontinental Railroad from the west towards the east. And when that was finished, they were just abandoned. So you have Chinese people in the Dakotas, in Iowa, in Louisiana, in Texas, in Mississippi, right? Now, I'm going to come back to today. One of the things that we know, Harriet, is that most immigrants who come to these United States get off that plane saying, thank God I ain't Black, right? Thank God I'm not Negro, right? Thank God I'm not African American, right? Because in this country, it is our race which has us in the pecking order delineated at the bottom of the racial pecking order, right? Now, thank God I ain't them, they say, right? And here we are. What we see is that everybody is so glad to not be us, right? And we caught the most hell out of anybody in this country. And when the time came when we were catching hell, you know who we were looking to? We were looking to allies, supporters, anybody who's going to say, y'all need to stop this. We need to stop this. They are human beings like us. So from that pain, what we look for is who stood up for us?
That's right.
Right? Who did stand up for us when we were getting lynched, bombed, murdered? Oh, wait, that's still going on, right? I'm not even putting that in the past. That is still going on. And thank God these days we saw a certain demographic group, millennials, Gen Ys, out in the streets, marching, arms linked, Black Lives Matter. Remember that.
Yes.
Let's not forget that image. What I'm concerned that we didn't necessarily see were people of our generation, right, who were speaking out in support of Black people, speaking out against racial discrimination, targeting, etc. And so the same folks who say, thank God I ain't Black, also frequently say, well, I'm not saying nothing because if I say something, I may get painted with that same brush, right? Mm-hmm. So what you have, and I didn't hear these listeners, these brothers who you said called in, but what I can assume they're saying that Asians can't be victims of racism because the racism that they're identifying is racism towards Black people. And if you are a victim of racism, then where were you all? Where have you all been in this struggle, right? Mm-hmm. Now, so part of the question and part of the struggle has to be one where, again, we have to remember how successful keeping races divided has been for these United States. So the more we turn against each other, people of color turn against each other, right? The greater the likelihood is that we will never achieve any kind of fairness nor equity. I want to say at this point, if we begin to talk about the most recent increase in attacks against Asian and Asian American people in the United States, we talk about that. Here's what I want to point out. Much of the video that we are seeing over and over and over again shows the physical attack on Asian American people, frequently women, but also men, frequent attacks on Asian American women, and the perpetrator, the attacker, is frequently a person of color, most often a Black person, right? And then let me go to the subtext here. Mm-hmm. The subtext of what we are seeing in those attacks, most often it's homeless people, mm-hmm. and most often it's people who are suffering mental illness, right? Yes. Who, as a race, is overrepresented among homeless people and the mentally ill walking the streets? People of color. That's right. And predominant in that group, it's Black people. So the instances of hate does include white people for certain. It does include every other race. However, what we're seeing on these videotapes that get captured, right? And I'm not saying it's not Black people. I'm saying it's homeless people, not trying to castigate all homeless people. Right. It's mentally ill people, not trying to castigate all mentally ill people. But at the point where these groups become conflated, Black, homeless, mentally ill, that is mostly what you're seeing when mm-hmm. you're looking at those videotapes. So how do we address that issue? When you have the man who used to populate the White House identifying those people as the boogeyman, those people as the ones who are making everybody sick, those people who have the Wuhan flu, the Hong Kong virus, you are putting a target on their backs, right? And I'm saying to everybody who's listening, regardless of race or gender or nationality, understand what's happening. You're looking at a slice. You're not understanding the full import, the full picture. And all I'm saying is that no, it should not be that these people are not prosecuted, but if they are mentally ill, they probably should not be prosecuted in the same way that they would be prosecuted if they did it with knowledge and planning of forethought, with their full mental faculties, right? And if we want to address this, then let's begin to talk about homelessness. Let's begin to talk about emptying the mental health hospitals of all of those patients who really did need to remain inside the hospitals and be treated. That's right. I'm not trying to take attention from it, but just as we talked about the 1830s and 1840s and mining and how did the Chinese get, I can bring it all the way back to this one fact that I want to now make sure I leave with you. Harriet, the Chinese Exclusion Acts continued until the year 1943. Why did they end in 1943? They ended around 1943, 1944, because when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the United States' most eastern outpost in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, was destroyed. The United States wanted to retaliate against Japan. The only way for them to have retaliated would have been if the pilots were on suicide missions, because there was no way for them to have enough fuel to bomb Japan and return to the United States, not to the continent. So what did the United States do? They made a pact with China. That is how China and the United States became allies during World War II, so that the pilots could land the bombers in China, refuel, bomb Japan, and get back to the United States, right? That is how and why the Chinese Exclusion Acts were ended, because the president said, oh, well, we have to demonstrate to China some goodwill, right? We have to stop banning all Chinese from being US citizens. So they stopped the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And what did they put in place? The Chinese immigration quota. The Chinese immigration quota went into effect in 1944, and beginning in that year, 105 Chinese annually were awarded visas to enter the United States. You hear what I'm saying? The room that you're in can hold 105 people.
Wow.
105. The limit was 105. That continued until when? Tell me when. 1965 with the Immigration and Naturalization Act. 1965. You understand what I'm saying? Yes. It's all connected. It is all connected. We have to look at the propagation of racism by the United States towards non-Western European peoples, right? All those people from the places that 45 called those shit countries. Yep. Remember that?
Yeah.
Right? So those are the countries. Those are the people who are right now, in terms of the population of the United States, it's those populations that are growing. Hence, we have the insurrection on January 6th to try to what? Make sure that Congress stops letting who? Those people in, and stop giving who? Those people power. That's what we're seeing.
You are listening right now to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole here on WBAI 99.5 FM in New York City and everywhere online at WBAI.org. Whew, my friend Paula Madison is dropping knowledge right now. I hope you all are taking notes, because this is a history lesson. You know, it's important for us to know our history, and so many of us don't. Even when you are attempting to, there's so much that you don't know. But one thing that WBAI, which is 61 years old, we survived the pandemic as a listener-sponsored radio station. That is something that we should all be proud of, because it is because of listeners that we are alive. So many businesses have gone out of business. So many great institutions have not been able to survive, and we have, and it's because of you, because of listeners who become family. And you want to hear all the guests that we have, all the music that's here 24/7, and you support us. So we're asking you to support us today. Our number is 212-209-2950. You can call and make a contribution of any size. You could also go online at give2WBAI.org. And we hope that you will contribute as generously as you can. We need you in order to stay on the air. And come on, Paula Madison. I got Paula Madison on my show. I'm so excited. Every time I talk, look, the first time that I talked to Paula, you were a panelist, and I was moderating this panel for Reverend Al Sharpton at National Action Network convention.
That's
and
right.
There were a gazillion people on the panel. And I was trying to make sure everybody got to talk. And I listened to Paula, and I was like, oh my goodness, she has to be in my life. And and at the time I was with Ebony Magazine, helping to run that magazine. And so first I was like, Paula, I know I'm so busy, you're so busy, but I just want you to be my friend.
and we became that and more.
But the funny thing is, then I realized I can't be her friend yet. I have to interview her first. Remember? I said, okay, Paula, let's put friends on hold for a minute. Can I please interview you? And what did you say? Yes, but we knew Prince was going to be on the cover of Ebony Magazine. You said, if you get me to meet Prince. So, and all of it happened, Paula.
It all happened. Harriet introduced me to Prince. We became friends. We worked with him and for him for a while, and it was amazing.
Oh my goodness.
But equally important. So we became friends and sisters, and got to know Harriet's husband George Chinsey and their daughter Carrie, and it was like family because it was all of that. Absolutely.
From the first day.
From the moment.
And sometimes things happen like that. And I'm just saying, I'm so grateful to talk to you now. And we just have we've got about 5 minutes left. So Paula, give us some instruction.
Sure.
What can folks do now to look at each other differently, to see the oneness and to move forward in a positive way?
Right. So what I have spent my most recent years, Harriet, trying to bring about conversations between people who are of the African descent and people who the African diaspora and the Chinese diaspora, right? And the easiest part for me, the intersection, of course, has to do with the Caribbean and specifically Jamaica, where so much of this is just, it just is. And I don't want to suggest that it's problem free, because it's not problem free. What I think and what I would implore people to do is to, as much as possible, to blur the lines that define and dictate what is a citizen of a particular location. Blur those lines, right? Because what I know about my own history is my family, my Africanness comes from the Akan or the Ashanti people of present day Ghana. I've been to Ghana, right? I know people in Accra and Kumasi. I met the king of the Ashanti people who bestowed upon me my Ashanti name. I've been to China. I've met my 300 plus descendants of my Chinese grandfather. We are one big family. My point about all of this is that it is so much easier in terms of seeing yourself and who you are in the world when you understand, particularly as African Americans, that our lives did not begin with slavery. Our lives did not begin from a point of oppression, subjugation, brutality, rape. Those absolutely are parts of who we are. They're part of our legacy and history, and therefore I completely 1000% believe in reparations, even though I wouldn't get any, because I am not the descendant of Africans who were enslaved in the US, but my daughter would, my grandson would, and many, many, many people who deserve would. But what I'm saying here is that if we start to educate ourselves and our children to know that we as Africans are a global people, name a nation in the world and Africans are there. We're everywhere. What we have to do is realize, while we live here, we love here, we are educated here, there's a whole big world out there that we can interact with. And it gives us not only connections and linkages, we're not floating in space, abandoned, looking for someone to support us. We are part of a much larger collective, a much larger people, right? And for me and George and Carrie, here's what I say. We actually hail from the people who populate the most populous nation on the planet.
That's true.
China is the most populous nation of the planet, right? What we, those of us who are Chinese and Black, have to offer is linkages and the ability to form these intersections, so that when you tell me that Carrie is researching her history right now, I say, send a little sister to me. Send her to me. I got more information and referrals and books for her, because and you don't just have to be of this heritage, particular heritage, in order to understand this. I think that for us to be truly educated and truly not just safe in the world, but the ability to be free in the world, we can't limit ourselves nor our knowledge to just these United States.
Amen. You know what? As you're saying this, I'm just thinking Marcus Garvey. I mean, that brother understood.
The UNIA, United Negro Improvement, the Black Star Line. If they don't want us here, let's get on boats, he said, and go back to Africa.
He was a powerful brother. As are you a powerful sister. Thank you so much, Paula.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure. Have me back whenever you think about it. I'm happy to see you, my sister. We will get together again.
I look forward to it. Thank you so very, very much. Hey, guys, that was an amazing hour, huh? Talking to Paula Madison, her book and film, Finding Samuel Lowe. You should read. She researched her family history. We didn't even get into all that because we had so many things to discuss, but you can read and learn. Finding Samuel Lowe is an amazing read, chock full of history. I thank you for being with me. Until next time, have a great day and make it count.